Welcome to another edition of the China Forum. My name is Kerry Dumbaugh. The United States economy depends heavily on foreign capital inflows, and China is a key contributor to these capital inflows. But what does that mean for the United States? We have two experts here today who will help us address that question. Immediately to my left is Mike Martin, an analyst in Asian trade and finance with the Congressional Research Service. And keeping it in the family is Wayne Morrison, specialist in international trade and finance, also with the Congressional Research Service. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Wayne, you've just written a paper for CRS on China's holding of U.S. securities. Can you explain to us why China is investing in U.S. securities and what the scope of those holdings are?
Sure. This really goes back to China's currency policy. Because China maintains a more or less managed peg, it has to intervene heavily in international exchange rate markets to purchase U.S. dollars.
When you say managed peg, you mean their currency, the yuan, to a basket of currencies?
That's correct. That's correct. But it's mainly tied to the U.S. dollar. In order to maintain the rate that they want to keep, they have to intervene by a lot of dollars. And because China is holding a lot of dollars, you can't just put it under the mattress, you have to invest it. And so that's what China's doing. What's really interesting is to see the rate of increase in China's foreign exchange reserves. It's gone from $216 billion in 2001 to about $1.5 trillion.
This is just of U.S. currency.
This is their total foreign exchange reserves. We don't know what China's U.S. Currency holdings are, but most experts think about 70% of those holdings are in U.S. securities.
And so what, with these foreign exchange holdings, they buy U.S. securities. Is there an estimate at all about the level? Does IMF or does somebody report on what the level of holdings are?
Well, the U.S. Department of Treasury every year around June issues a report that estimates all countries' holdings of U.S. securities. And when we talk about U.S. securities, we're talking about U.S. Treasury securities, we're talking about stocks, we're talking about corporate debt securities, and we're talking about U.S. agent securities, which include U.S. government agencies and government organizations that are set up by the U.S. government, such as Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. The last report that they issued has data through June 2006. And so their estimates that China's holdings are around $700 billion. And that ranks them as second after Japan as second largest foreign holders of U.S. securities.
$700 billion is a lot of money.
It is a lot of money. And one of the problems in the U.S. economy is we have a very low savings rate. And so if the Chinese were not willing to put that money in the U.S. economy, then the U.S. would have to get that money elsewhere and to keep our economy running strong.
Well, you're leading right up to something else I wanted to ask you. So China is investing in T-bills. I mean, what does that mean for us? What are some of the implications? You said that it helps us maintain our low savings rate, I guess. What else?
Well, with Treasury securities, the main factor involved in that is their U.S. federal budget deficit. And the way the government can fund that is through Treasury securities. And in that category, China is the second largest holder, and it's one of the fastest growing holders. It went from 7th 10 years ago, and now it's number 2. And so the latest data we have is for December 2007. Their holdings are about $406 billion. So that money goes directly to help fund the federal budget deficit. Without that money, the federal government would have to raise capital somewhere else, and possibly interest rates would have to go up as a result.
So our interest rates are low in part because of this foreign capital.
That's right.
From
it
China.
Helps. It helps. It's a major factor to help keep those interest rates low.
Has China, I mean, if they're investing in our market and in T-bills, is there any indication that they have been hurt by the subprime mortgage crisis and other financial upheavals in the United States?
There is some indication that the Chinese banks have lost some money. Several banks have come out with quarterly statements indicating that they have lost some money. We don't know the total amount, but there are some indications that they were heavily involved in subprime. So they have lost some money, and they have indicated so, but we don't know to what extent. They claim it's very low, but some other experts may feel that it's much higher than that.
Part of this whole equation of China investing in the United States is the sovereign wealth fund. And I want to ask you about that, Mike. China, I guess just last year in 2007, created a sovereign wealth fund. Can you define what that is for us?
Well, I can give you one possible definition, which is what the US Treasury uses, because there isn't a general consensus of what is or isn't a sovereign wealth fund. Basically, it is where you have a government entity or agency that is using foreign exchange, like Wayne was talking about, and investing it basically as if it were a private investor, separate from holding reserves which they might need for other purposes. So it's basically a government agency operating like a private investor.
How much does China have in this new sovereign wealth fund?
They were given originally $200 billion, but they've used about 2/3 of it for domestic investment purposes, some of which may have been politically motivated, some which may have been economically desirable. So they're currently holding about $70 billion US dollars, which they haven't invested yet, and they're looking for places to invest around the world.
According to Wayne, if they have $1.4 trillion, $1.5 trillion, could they technically pump all of that into their sovereign wealth fund?
What they want to do is what they want to do. But yes, potentially up to most of that, up to $1.5 trillion, could be moved into it. Actually, that's one of the issues that many of us are looking at. They've been given the $200 billion. They have about $70 billion to invest. According to their head, the head of the China Investment Corporation, the name of the sovereign wealth fund, they're supposed to make somewhere around 5% rate of return. His attitude is that if he makes that rate of return and does well, then the government may give them more of that $1.5 trillion. However, if he doesn't do well, there's a potential that the whole thing will be closed up and it'll be just a little blip in history.
Now, the sovereign wealth fund that China has, are they using it to invest in T-bills and just the typical of their other investments, or is it
Well,
being
no,
used for
the idea of it
something
is, going back to what Wayne was talking about, T-bills currently give you 4% rate of return, which China was considering relatively low, particularly given their currency relative to the US dollar was gaining about 6 or 7% per year. They were actually losing money on their investment in treasury bills. So they were looking for a place where they can invest their money and earn a higher rate of return, like a private investor would. So they're looking away from T-bills, treasury bills, for investments, and are looking for other things. For example, they bought 9.9% of Morgan Stanley in a non-voting shares. That means they have no control over the management, in theory. They bought 9.9% of Morgan Stanley when Morgan Stanley was low, in part because the subprime mortgage loan problems that the United States is having.
I want to get more to that in a minute, but before we just leave sovereign wealth funds, is China's the only one? There are others out there, aren't they?
Sovereign wealth funds have been around for over 50 years. A lot of tech nations, the oil exporting countries, have sovereign wealth funds, as well as China has one. Russia's starting one. Japan's considering starting one. What's happened over the last couple of years is that more countries are setting up these sovereign wealth funds, in part because they have excess foreign exchange. They need to invest it someplace, and treasury bills are not offering a high enough rate of return in these days.
So these funds could become major players in the global economy if they aren't already.
Right now, sovereign wealth funds, according to some estimates, have about $2 billion to invest around the world. There's an estimate that by 2015, they'll have about $12 billion to invest around the world, which is, I think, a fair amount of money.